so that we can record this. All right. So we are taking our lesson here today, and we're thinking about the resurrection from the viewpoint of a journalist. Something kind of interesting is that there have been people who try to use, rationalism to try to prove the legitimacy of the resurrection, and they've tried to do so through many different forms of um, sciences, I guess we would say. Some people have studied the ancient biblical languages. One of the things we're going to note in our upcoming Sunday lesson is how Pilate wrote this inscription above Jesus in three different languages: Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. And some people have studied those languages and just study that inscription. Some people use theology, some people use history to try to prove the resurrection. Lawyers have actually examined the judicial trials of Jesus and looked at it from kind of a legal, judicial standpoint. We actually, in one of our previous lessons, we studied about a physician's viewpoint of the death of Jesus. So looked at what was medically happening to Jesus to try to think about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus in a scientific way. And there's even been people, if you've heard of the Shroud of Turin, there's been people who have used chemistry and physics and microbiology trying to prove that could possibly be the burial wrapping for Christ's body in the tomb. And so there's been all sorts of fields of study that have been used to try to research more and get people to think more about the legitimacy of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And one of the things we want to look at today is actually journalism. I find journalism to be pretty interesting. I know Seth is on here, and Seth was a journalism major, so I'm sure Seth finds journalism to be pretty interesting since that's his field of work. I'm an English ed major, but I had to take some journalism classes in college, and I really enjoyed it. I loved it. If you can make money in journalism, that'd be something I'd be interested in. But newspapers are dying. They're a dying breed a little bit. So it's a tough field for a lot of people. But we want to look at the resurrection through the eyes of a journalistic reporter. Now, Melvin Mincher, who is of Columbia University, he noted several factors which help a reporter identify a newsworthy story. And I want to show those to you. They were in your lesson. But take a look at what he says from a journalism standpoint. Here are some of the things that make a story a newsworthy story. So he says, first of all, it has to have an impact. All right, it has to have an impact. Basically, if this report is going to have a significant influence on the public, then that's one aspect of a story being newsworthy. Obviously, a presidential election is going to have an impact upon the public, and so it gets reported. If there's rioting and looting, we've seen a lot of reports about that. Well, that's going to have an impact upon the city, especially if you live near it, and so that's going to influence the public. Some people believe climate change and weather, that's going to influence the public. Anytime there's a thunderstorm or a tornado, or there's been a blizzard that's coming through, that's going to influence the public. So those things make headlines because the public's interested in it. Timeliness is another thing that impacts the public. Reports on events that have occurred quite recently, because news value diminishes with time. All right. The tornado that might have affected a community 6 months ago, that's probably not going to make headlines, today. It would have made headlines the day after, or perhaps within the week after. But after that, people kind of forget about what's just happened and move on to other things. And so timeliness is important. Prominence is important, because sometimes famous people, rich people who have larger impacts from the vantage point of others upon a community, reports that involve famous people or famous institutions, those tend to reach a little higher on the headlines. I mean, when somebody who has been in public office or someone who has donated, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to scholarship funds and the local hospitals, when they die, that might make, the front page of the paper. When, just the old common person who's never going to have their names on the side of a building or on a street, when they pass away, you just kind of get a little excerpt in the obituaries. And so prominence influences, whether it's a newsworthy story, proximity, if it has a geographical and ethnic and economic, if it has some sort of angle that establishes a close personal connection to the typical reader, then that indicates that it's a newsworthy story. Then there's also conflict. People like conflict, people like drama. And so conflict tends to make headlines, all right? That's why Ohio State, Michigan makes more headlines than typically an Ohio State, Indiana game, right? We like the conflict a little bit better. But when there's conflict between individuals, they could be running for office, conflict between organizations or something that occurs even inside an individual, such as someone having anguish over a personal tragedy or someone's personal search for truth or meaning. When there's inner conflict and inner angst, those types of things make headlines. Surprise makes headlines, reports that highlight activities, ideas, or people that are especially unusual. So we like to hear about things that are a little bit different, not just kind of your everyday things. And then currency. Even if an issue or condition has been around for years, such as poverty, or as is mentioned also in this excerpt, poverty or child abuse, it may become newsworthy because of a new public interest in the subject. I think we could say that most recently about racism, for example. Racism was pretty heavily in the news, especially in the 50s and 60s when you had Martin Luther King Jr. and many people who were marching in the civil rights movement. Seems to have died down for a while, but recently that topic has been back in the headlines again. And things like that come back into the headlines over and over and over again with time. So we want to think about, these are all the things that make for a newsworthy story. It's worth writing about. And we want to think about the resurrection from this viewpoint. Clearly, it has an impact because Jesus died and was raised so that we could have hope in him. We might say that it's timely. Now, it happened a long time ago, but it's still something that affects us. It's about a prominent person. You can't say Jesus Christ isn't a prominent person. He's been the most influential character in Western civilization. Hospitals have been built based upon principles of Jesus. Charities have begun. Churches are on every street corner who claim to be followers of Jesus. And so clearly Jesus is a prominent individual and the church is a prominent institution. Proximity. If we take a look at this from a biblical viewpoint, Jesus dying in Jerusalem was in close proximity to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who were living and working in that area around that time. So it had a huge impact upon them. There's clearly a conflict. There's conflict between the Jewish parties and between Jesus and between Jesus' followers. And so there's a big time conflict that exists. And then there's this inner angst of, should I believe in Jesus or not? And so people have personal conflict over whether or not they're going to believe in Jesus and believe that the signs and the miracles that are recorded about him are influential enough that someone would change their life for Jesus. Clearly, there's an element of surprise in the resurrection. Wouldn't you say? A dead man lived. He was dead for 3 days, and then he rose. That's not something you hear about every day. And so this is newsworthy from a journalistic standpoint. And then it has some currency. Sure, this happened 2,000 years ago, but this has a lot to do with our morals. This has a lot to do with how we will function as a society, how we will operate in our families, how we will treat one another, whether or not Jesus was raised from the dead or not. And so when I look at all of these qualifications of a newsworthy story, Jesus is a newsworthy story. And that's why you have 4 gospel writers writing about him, and then other New Testament authors beyond just the 4 gospels. So let's think a little bit once we kind of go through that introductory section, I want you to consider from a journalistic standpoint some of the rules of first-rate reporting. Because sometimes the authors of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they come under attack. People look for, reasons to dismiss what they've written. They look for contradictions in what they've written. They look for problems. They look for bias. They look for ways to discredit what has been written about Jesus by the authors. And so I want you to realize that, if we were judging them in the same way that we should judge journalists today, there's a lot of good things that we can consider about the authors who write about the resurrection of Jesus. One of the rules of first-rate reporting is, first of all, you need to check your facts. Pulitzer once said, one of the keys to a good news story is accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. Something, by the way, that I think sometimes is a problem in modern journalism, because we're trying to be the first ones to get the story out. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I try to tell myself, I try to tell my kids, wait for the real story to come out, okay? Because sometimes the first one to report isn't always accurate. One of the very key roles of a journalist is to make sure that what you write about is accurate and can be verified through sources. So how many sources verified the empty tomb? I'll let you guys talk for just a minute. How many sources verified the empty tomb?
Six or seven or more, I'd say. Mary, Peter, John, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and other women.
Okay, good. So we have several people. How many people write about it? Let's just take a look at this next chart here. This is basically what we're dealing with here today. We have the Gospel of Matthew. If you read chapter 28, verses 1 through 11, Gospel of Matthew writes about the empty tomb, the resurrection. Gospel of Mark, so Mark writes about it, chapter 16. The Gospel of Luke is one of the most extensive Gospels, chapter 24, 45 verses, where it gets a little more extensive. The Gospel of John gets even more extensive. Chapters 20 and 21 are about resurrection appearances of Jesus. And then you have Paul, who writes about it in 1 Corinthians 15. And we're going to study about Paul next week. And then you write about Peter, who seems to imply a belief in the resurrection and the empty tomb in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 and verse 21. And so we have at least 6 reports. So there's not a lack of reports. There's not a lack of reporting or sources when it comes to this topic. It's not like one person wrote about, the empty tomb of Jesus and then just changed the whole world. Multiple people wrote about this. And one of the things we mentioned last week in our study about the eyewitnesses is, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word will be established. We have 6 witnesses who write about this and confirm their information with other people. All right, so let's take a look at a second quality of first-rate reporting. And a second quality would be this: tell the other side of the story. That's very important. It's very easy to write with bias, to write a one-sided view of the story. And so it's important for authors to make sure that they're including conflicting or opposing sources, or else we get accused of bias. So I want you to notice some things that are found in the resurrection report, which are in we're looking at the Gospels primarily, but notice some statements that are found in the following passages, which indicate that some of the disciples were not quick to believe the empty tomb report, because I think this gives actually credibility to the report. Take a look at it. So next slide here, let's see, Luke 24, verse 9. Notice what happens when the women returned from the tomb. They told all these things to the 11, that's the 11 apostles, and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. I think that's a kind of an interesting detail, because I feel like today, if we were trying to really get people to believe in the resurrection, we would kind of leave out this very negative point, which indicates the apostles didn't really believe it happened. And yet, this actually gives credibility to the fact that it happened. These apostles viewed these women's story as nonsense. They thought they were talking crazy. It was an idle tale. And so a conflicting idea is included in the gospel account of Luke. And then you've got John, who in John chapter 20, 24, and 25, Thomas basically tells the other disciples, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails and, put my finger into the mark of the nails and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. So you have one of the apostles literally saying, I'm not going to believe in this Jesus. A lot of people today would not want to include that. That makes Thomas look bad, people would think to themselves. So let's exclude that information. But the gospel writers, I believe, are very balanced in their reporting. They report the positive things that occurred, the belief that occurred by the women, for example, when they saw Jesus. And they also include some of the unbelief, some of the disbelief that takes place. So Thomas, even though he's one of Jesus' top apostles, has trouble believing. And that's included in the gospel account. It's also interesting, for example, that Mary Magdalene looks right at Jesus in John 20 and doesn't recognize him. That's kind of interesting that you would include that, but that's included in the gospel account. And it's interesting that when Cleopas and there was another disciple who were on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24, when they were walking and talking with Jesus, they didn't even recognize him at first. And that's an interesting detail to include, that you would include that. But to me, they're details that are important because it indicates the writers were trying to write without bias. It may be completely impossible to completely write without bias with ultimate objectivity, but the gospel writers, I believe, looking at it from a journalistic standpoint, were trying to write honestly. We're trying to be even-handed in how they reported this. Take a look at a couple other things here. And if anybody wants to jump in, just jump in, put something in the chat box if you want to interrupt me. I'm just kind of working my way through this. All right. One of the other important rules of first-rate reporting is you name your sources. Okay. Have you ever seen a report where somebody says, well, this source was speaking on condition of anonymity, and that's the only source? So this one person who wants to remain anonymous is the one source you have, and nobody knows who he is. So nobody can go to this source and verify what this person said or supposedly witnessed or knows. It makes your story pretty weak when those are your only sources. And so part of good reporting, journalistic reporting, is that you can verify your sources. Your sources are named rather than, a government source reported or an industry insider says or an expert speaking on condition of anonymity. So one of the neat things about the Gospels is that they're written within the lifetimes, especially Matthew, Mark, Luke, are written within the lifetimes of those who witnessed the resurrection. So if someone had a question about whether or not Mary Magdalene actually saw Jesus, or about whether Peter saw Jesus, or whoever it might be who specifically mentioned, they could have gone and asked them. They could have gone and verified, Luke's writing this about you. Did you actually see Jesus resurrected? And that gives credibility to the story when you can question the witnesses, especially in the first century. So who are some of the named sources? I think Phil went ahead and mentioned a couple of them to us earlier, who are some of the named sources in the accounts?
You had Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Okay, good. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus. So she's called the mother of James. In one passage, she's called the mother of Joseph. Another passage. Salome is mentioned. Joanna is mentioned in Luke 24, and then there's other women who are also mentioned as being there who aren't named. And so there are some unnamed people, but there are several named people. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Joseph and James, the Salome, Joanna. And then in John 21, there's 7 disciples by the sea who are witnesses of Jesus. Peter is mentioned, Thomas is mentioned, Nathanael is mentioned, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, are mentioned. And then there's 2 other unnamed people. But you have several people who are mentioned as eyewitnesses. And then when you read Acts 1, right before the ascension, you have more people who are mentioned as witnesses right before the ascension. Mary, the mother of Jesus, Jesus' 4 brothers are there, James, Joseph, Simon, Judas. There's some extra ones who saw the resurrected Jesus. So a lot of named sources, which help give, again, credibility to the fact of the resurrection, right? Another basic rule of first-rate reporting, as much as you can. Now, this is difficult, but keep your prejudices out of the story. Why, by the way, would it have been difficult for people who were the disciples of Jesus to try to have remained unprejudiced about Jesus? Why would that be difficult?
They are, they're not only firsthand because they were witnesses, a lot of them, but because they're writing for him. They're writing for the truth, and it would definitely be typical of someone in that position to want to slant their quote unquote coverage toward him.
Yeah, very true. I mean, if someone who was a close friend of yours for 3 years just got brutally murdered and slain unjustly, would it be easy for you to try to remain unbiased about the situation as you reported it? It'd probably be difficult. You're emotionally attached to the situation. I don't know if you guys like cop shows or not. I don't watch hardly any TV at all, but but Jonna likes a good mystery. All right, she likes to watch mysteries and cop shows and that sort of stuff. And you'll get, sometimes you'll watch this cop show and they'll say, well, I'm taking you off the case. Why are you taking me off the case? Because you're related to this person, or you were friends with this person, so you have an emotional connection. And that's what makes it a good story, is they have an emotional connection. And so them trying to not get involved in the case is a big part of the whole storyline. But obviously, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are involved in the case. All right. But one of the awesome things, I think, when I read their writings is they don't seem to write in a prejudicial fashion. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of that that you see here from, for example, Matthew 28. Matthew 28 and verse 16. It says, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. I like the fact that Matthew includes that some of the disciples were still having trouble believing that Jesus really did rise from the dead. They're still struggling with some doubt. And Matthew does not write about that prejudicially. He doesn't just say they all went and worshiped him, and as soon as they saw Jesus, they all believed. That would be writing about it prejudicially if it didn't actually happen that way. Matthew includes a very balanced view that some people were still struggling with this. They'd never seen a dead man walking, so it was hard for them to believe. especially someone as brutally murdered as Jesus was. He doesn't disparage Pilate. Okay, when you read Matthew 28, Pilate said to them, you have a guard of soldiers, go make it as secure as you can. That's when they heard, hey, this guy talked about how he was going to be raised from the dead. And Pilate says, you have a guard, go make it secure. One of the things I like about how Matthew writes that is he doesn't say, Pilate, that filthy little creep, went ahead and put a guard around the tomb because he was afraid that Jesus might raise from the dead, and that might look bad for him politically. We know that's probably what was going on when we look at it, 2,000 years down the road and consider Pilate. But when you write about someone in a disparaging way, when you put people down when you write, instead of just letting the facts speak for themselves, you're writing with bias. And you need to take your bias out of your writing. The facts themselves should allow people to make decisions about how they feel about Pilate or the soldiers or the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, or the disciples. The facts themselves tell the story. You don't have to put people down to try to win your way into the story. That's writing persuasively, and the Gospels are written informatively. I've got a quote here in the chat box from Robert. He says, side thoughts. You talk about having a balancing report. We do well to show that in how we talk about people. So often refer to Thomas as doubting Thomas. We often think about this passage of his doubt and overlook that he was likely grieving on his own over the crucifixion, so not with the others when the news of resurrection was made. When earlier he was willing to die with Jesus in Jerusalem, yet we don't call him Thomas the Brave. We do well to know his good qualities and should know the good qualities of fellow brethren. So that's a good point, Robert. It's a good point. And you're right. We could say the same thing about Peter. We think about Peter's failure. We don't think about all the positive things we could say about Peter. But the Gospels don't ever really, other than using the words of Jesus himself and how he felt about Peter sometimes, get behind me, Satan. Oh, you of little faith. He rebukes them for their unbelief. But other than stating the facts or stating direct quotations, the gospel writers themselves don't insult any of the believers, unbelievers, enemies of Jesus. And I do think that's a good example for us to consider. Let's let the facts speak for themselves without insult. That's a argumentum ad hominem, right? When you attack the messenger, you attack people. Your argument is attacking people instead of actually dealing with the arguments. It also admits omissions. All right, anybody who's written, let's say Seth, there, you've got a space constraint when you write a story for your newspapers, right? You have to do it in so many words. You've got a limit as to how much space they're going to give you. And so you've probably got a lot more material than ever gets included in the actual story. And John actually admits that. He says in chapter 21 or verse 25, there are many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So John says, I've got more material than I'm including here. So I'm omitting some things, but these are the things that I'm including that I think make the point about Jesus that he wanted to make, which was that these signs prove he's the Son of God. All right. So
if I could add something.
Sure.
I like that last passage there where, it really comes to show not every good thing we do will necessarily be reported. Not every good work we do will necessarily be known. It will certainly be known to God, but there's going to be things that we're not necessarily going to be given specific credit for, and certainly we should not strive to be known for every little good thing that we do. That's overlooking the purpose of why we're doing these good works in the first place.
Okay. Good thoughts. Good thoughts. Balanced, fair, writing without prejudice. I think these are things that we see in the Gospels. Peter had failures. Thomas had failures. Philip didn't always think straight. James and John wanted to blow up a Samaritan village. These things are included in the Gospel accounts, which indicates the Gospel writers were trying to be fair and balanced with how they were presenting the story. And so I think they're to be commended for that. I think there's some good things about how they were writing and what they were writing from a journalistic viewpoint. All right, let's take a look at another element of first-rate reporting. One of them would be ask tough questions. Okay, you've got to be willing to ask tough questions. In order to be a journalist, you got to ask the hard questions, the questions that might make people uncomfortable. And you've got to be willing to research before you write. And Luke, when he begins his gospel, he mentions something in the introduction to his gospel. How has he acquired much of his information? Luke wasn't always an eyewitness to everything that he writes about in his gospel. He's an eyewitness of a lot of things in the book of Acts because he's with Paul for much of the book of Acts. But everything in the gospel, he's not always an eyewitness. Where does he get his information? He's got to ask questions. He's got to ask questions. He's got to go to the eyewitnesses. He's got to investigate them, and he's got to ask them questions. Look at Luke chapter 1. Look at the introduction and verse 2. He says, many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account. And so he mentions that there were other eyewitnesses and ministers who delivered this information to us. So Luke acquires his information from eyewitness testimony so he can write his gospel. I mean, think about Luke 24. There's this long section about Cleopas and an unnamed disciple. How does Luke know about that? Luke wasn't there. Cleopas and his friend must have been questioned by Luke, and Luke had the opportunity to interrogate them, to investigate, to find out information. So he would have acquired his info from asking good questions. And so that's also one of the neat things I think about the Gospels, especially with Luke. He asks a lot of good questions that lead to some of the stories that he writes about. A sixth quality, and I'm skipping through, actually. I could probably give you like 15 of these, but we're limiting to just a few. But include realistic quotations. Anybody here into Hallmark movies? I'm not, but I know there's people that are. But look, here's why I'm not. Cheesy dialogue, all right? Who talks like that, all right? It's not realistic conversations. Almost funny to me to watch. Maybe you do talk like that, and good for you. But one of the things when you read the gospel story is that there's some very realistic conversation. There's some realistic quotations, some realistic dialogue. The gospel writers, because of how different people converse differently, they seem to convey that when you look at the different conversations. They don't just make up quotes. Some people will make up quotes to help tell a story. I remember when I lived in Indiana, I was working on a grant project for our park and tree board. We did a big tree planting at a community park. And so I was being interviewed by the newspaper. And after I read the story, I thought, I never said half of these things. This guy is just making up quotes. I don't remember saying any of these things. But I guess it made his story better or easier. And he just kind of filled in the blanks himself. But when you read some of these conversations, do they sound real? John 20, verse 16. Here's some of them here on your screen. Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him in Aramaic, Rabboni. There's not this long, drawn out conversation. She just says her name. She looks at him. He says her name. She looks at him and recognizes that he's her teacher. And that's all that needs to be said in that instance. You got another conversation that to me seems kind of realistic, which is the John 20:25. The other disciples, Thomas is having a hard time believing. And the other disciples say, we have seen the Lord. They seem to be excited about this. And he says, which you can kind of see somebody saying this, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails and place my finger into the mark of the nails and place my hand at his side, I'm not believing. It's almost like he's saying this with, you guys are nuts. This is crazy. I better have some really good evidence if I'm going to believe. That's a very realistic sounding conversation to me, that someone would have a hard time really being convinced that the resurrection actually happened. All right. And then Mark 16:6, he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus who is crucified. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. You can see, a garden. This is someone, they supposed to be a gardener, but you can just kind of see someone. Jesus isn't in the tomb. Take a look at it. He's not there. He's risen. And just kind of explaining it. And that's all you need to do. I don't have to go into a long, detailed theology of why he's risen. It's just that he was here. He's not here. Take a look and then go your way. These are just very real quotations, very real conversations that take place. And we could look at, even more of them, the conversation between Jesus and Peter when he says, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. And where Jesus is kind of grilling him. That seems to be a pretty realistic conversation as well. But there's some realistic stuff there from a journalistic viewpoint. Number 7, expect your story. This is something we touched on last week, but expect your story to sound different from other reporters covering the same event. All right. Something in the chat box just popped up here. Zip. He says, that's the drive-by media for you. If you can't say something newsworthy, they'll make it up. Good thing this wasn't the standard for Bible reporting. Maybe so. We could probably have a really long conversation about modern media, but we're just trying to look at this from a first century standpoint of good reporting. All right. So when you write a completely identical story, that looks like plagiarism. Okay, when word for word you've copied something down, it looks like plagiarism. It looks like collusion. If Matthew was just copying down word for word everything Mark said, then it really wouldn't be 2 gospels, would it? It would really be one and somebody plagiarized the other one. So the gospel records have similarities. We would expect that because they're reporting about the same thing, but are they exactly the same? And would we expect, if multiple people told the same story, would we expect there to be some differences? I think we need to consider that part of first-rate reporting is that we would expect some of the witnesses, some of the reports to be slightly different while telling the same story. And that's a good thing. Methodical Matthew, who is this tax collector before he converts, so he probably thinks very mathematically. I'm thinking a very organized thinker. Some people have even said he groups things in 3s and groups things in 7s. But methodical Matthew does not think or explain things the same way that Luke, this compassionate physician, does. Matthew tends to write a lot more cerebrally, quotes a lot more facts and statistics. Luke tends to write a lot more compassionately and tells kind of stories to try to explain things. A very different style. When you read Mark, it's like Mark is saying as much as he can in these 16 chapters as quickly as he can, and he's just jotting it down as fast as he can. But then when you read John and you read his gospel, you think they're writing about a lot of the same stuff, but John writes about it in this very thoughtful, this very experienced, this very wise, in a way that makes you think John had to have really thought about how he was going to say that for a long time before he ever put it down on paper. And he did take a long time to put it on paper. He's one of the last gospels to have been written. And so we would expect that to be similar, but different. And when a witness's testimony is nearly identical, it looks like they were coached, looks like it was rehearsed rather than genuine. And I don't get that vibe. I don't think people get that feeling from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, the accounts can't be contradictory either. Okay. And we have to distinguish between differences and contradictions. Can you think are there any contradictions that you've heard people try to point out about the resurrection? That you guys can think of? Let me read an excerpt to you. This is from, and actually this is the outline for this lesson. I'm just taking some ideas from this book. It's called The Resurrection Report. All right. And this is written by William Proctor. See? And if you want to order this book, you can check it out. But he used to be a New York Daily News reporter. So he's got a pretty interesting perspective, I think, in his book. But he says this: although there are similarities among the resurrection accounts, it is clear that even the reports on the same events have been written by different observers. So here's a few examples. All four Gospels report the stone was rolled away from the tomb, but each gives special details. Matthew, for instance, says that an angel rolled away the stone. The other writers simply report the women observed that the stone had been moved. A lot of people might say, well, that's a contradiction. It's not a contradiction. It's two different vantage points of the story. Luke and Paul report that the risen Christ made a separate appearance to Peter, but they refer to the event in somewhat different terms. Luke says that the 11 apostles and some associates informed the two men who had encountered Jesus on the road to Emmaus about the appearance to Simon. Paul just says that he appeared to Peter. And there's variation in some of these reports as well. Paul uses the name Cephas, meaning rock. And Luke uses Peter's Jewish name, which is Simon. That's not a contradiction. That's two different individuals describing Peter in two different ways from their vantage point. There's really no special significance between the different ways in which these things are described. And it's certainly not a contradiction. It's just a different way that you would expect two different people to describe a situation. I'm looking right here at Zippy. Some people call Zippy Zippy. Some people call Zippy Rich. Is there a contradiction in those two things? No, Zippy and Rich are the same people. Just some people call him Zip and some people call him Rich. And depending on how well you know him, maybe you've had the right to call him Zippy. But we have different ways of referring to different people, and we would expect that to come out in how people talk. All right, one last thing to point out here. A journalist's story is often expected to answer the 5 W's. All right, even if you just took high school English, you probably had to write a story at some point where they said, hey, you need to make sure that in your first paragraph you include the 5 W's, right? Who, what, when, where, why, and then there's the how. So, when we think about the gospel reports, even though, in Matthew, you've only got 11 verses, really, Matthew 28 about the resurrection. Mark, you've only got about the same amount, 10, 11 verses. But from those 10, 11 verses, even though that's a short segment, we really get this information. Who did it involve? Well, the body of Jesus and the witnesses who saw the empty tomb of Jesus or got to see Jesus himself. What happened? The tomb of Jesus was found empty. After people had seen it occupied, they knew whose tomb it was. They knew where it was. They'd seen it occupied. They then saw it empty. When did it happen? Well, we're told by a couple different gospel writers. It's the day after the Sabbath, which would have been on a Sunday. Where did this occur? Well, this occurred in Jerusalem, the same weekend as Passover, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so this happens in Jerusalem, or just outside of Jerusalem, so in a very populated area. And why did it happen? Well, it happened, as you get to the end of the gospel accounts, as proof of the identity of Jesus, that he wasn't just a mere man, he was the Son of God, and his resurrection was part of proving that fact. We've got the who, we've got the what, the when, the where, the why, and how did it happen? God raised him from the dead. And so it's an exhibition of the power of God. You have all that in the resurrection story. So this very concise report, you have all of the very simple details of a good journalistic story. Casey said this about you, Zip. I'm going to share this, Casey, because this is funny. He said, Zip, Zippy, and Rich are distinctly different people, and you don't want to cross at least one of those people. Okay. All right. That's funny. So,
Hey, Josh.
hey, Michelle.
I told Casey, I said, now you know he's going to read that out loud because he don't know the difference of private or the whole group.
No, that's funny stuff. I had to read that. It was good. All right. This is our lesson for the day. So anything that you guys would add to what we have looked at today, and if you want to get really, really in depth about looking at this from a journalistic viewpoint, look, what I covered was like the first 45 pages of this book. And this book's a 200-page book. So there's a lot more information in here, really interesting. Just the way that he approaches looking at the resurrection is interesting. I like books like this because, it's crazy to me, but some people won't read the Bible, but they will read a book written by a secular author. And so if you're trying to talk to somebody about, especially somebody who disbelieves in Jesus himself, then sometimes having a book like The Case for Christ handy, or More Than a Carpenter, which is written by Josh McDowell, or The Resurrection Report by William Proctor, something like that, hand to that, say, read that and tell me what you think. Some people will read that. They won't read something as simple as 4 chapters in the Gospels, but they'll read this 200-page book about it. And so it could be a good evangelistic method for you as well, to try to hopefully get them to the point they'll take a look at what the Gospels actually say. So any other thoughts? Anything? Anybody want to add anything? All right. Well, I must have explained everything perfectly then. So no. It's 7:55 tomorrow. If some of you are celebrating Thanksgiving, I want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving. I hope that you enjoy it. Don't eat too much. I'm sitting here and looking into my kitchen. John has made these lemon ricotta cookies with his glaze and these little sprinkles, and I'm not allowed to eat that. Yeah, that's very, tonight I'm really exercising my self-control. Having to wait until tomorrow. So anybody want to lead us in prayers? We close out. I'm looking at you, Seth, and I see Seth and Robert on my screen. So Seth, would you lead us in a closing prayer?
Sure. I held back a lot during that because I had a lot of thoughts as you went through that entire thing as far as journalism goes, but be happy to talk with anybody. It didn't all really coincide with the Gospels, so I didn't really want to speak up too much about it, but there's a lot there.
Maybe you should write a book, Seth.
Let's go to God in prayer.
All right.
Dear God, we're so thankful for this time we have, this time, despite the fact we're not able to be in person, that we've got to be together in the Zoom meetings and learn from your word. And we're thankful for the time that Josh puts into preparing this, as we know that it likely takes a lot of extra effort to get these lessons ready and to put them up online for us. We pray those who may be traveling this next couple of days that they will be safe. And those of us, if we are going to see other family, that we can all be safe as far as COVID goes and the virus not spreading. Please be with people who are sick or in the hospital, or those who are recovering from surgeries. Please lend your healing hand on them, and also help the doctors and the nurses that are attending to them. Please be with us throughout the rest of this week. Help us be a shining example to those around us. Forgive us of all our sins. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Hope everybody has a great night, great weekend. I see Riley's on here, so I'm glad you could join us, Riley. Riley, nobody's got COVID in your house, right? Heard you guys were all exposed.
No, we are actually all so far fine. So
All right.
we only have a few more days to go.
All right, good. I actually see Ben Joy on here. I'm wondering if that's Ben Joy, because I was thinking Ben Joy took off for boot camp.
It's just me.
Oh, okay. Everything go
Yeah,
well? Yeah.
he left Monday afternoon. It was a little bit of a roller coaster. They were still getting his paperwork squared away like an hour before he left for the airport.
Oh, well.
But yeah, he made it. So
Okay. Good. All right. Well, good to hear from you, Elaine. Hope everything's well with you. I bet it's been a roller coaster. So thinking about you guys. We will look forward to seeing you Sunday. Y'all take care. Have a great week.